Welcome to North Bay 101, a weekly analysis of the top stories from California's North Bay region. Reporters and editors from 5 surrounding counties take an in-depth look at the headlines shaping our community. I'm your host, Chandra Back. This week, an investigation in Chico reveals local police had been granting ICE access to its license plate reader data.
That law is crystal clear that a law enforcement agency in the state of California is not allowed to share automated license plate reader information with any law enforcement agency outside of the state.
And why planes suddenly stopped flying over Bohemian Grove after residents spent 2 years being told the flight paths couldn't change.
All of a sudden, in a lot of their social media channels, they were like, hey, it's sounding quieter over our homes.
I'm joined by Elias Myers, reporter with ChicoSol. Elias, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And Ryan Sabalow, digital democracy reporter at CalMatters. Ryan, happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Elias, you uncovered that the Chico Police Department had been granting ICE and Border Patrol access to its license plate reader data. What got you looking into this in the first place?
I have been interested for a while in how artificial intelligence and advanced surveillance technologies are being deployed in cities across America. And I noticed that there was a class action lawsuit in Merced against the police of Merced, the city, and UC Merced for the sharing of their Motorola ALPR data with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And seeing that Chico is a similar sized city with a university and is in parallel with Merced in many ways, I was interested in seeing if that was happening in Chico as well.
And so you submitted these public record requests. What did you discover?
Yeah, so when I received the records from the city, I found that the city was sharing with over 20 federal agencies and over 80 out-of-state agencies. And with the brief legal understanding that I had around ALPR data sharing, I contacted people I knew at the ACLU, and they told me that this was potentially against state law.
Did the Chico Police Department know that this had been happening? When you brought this information to them, what did they say?
They told me that they had discovered this themselves in the preparation of my public records. They told me that as they were pulling the data to release to me, they noticed themselves that they were sharing this data with federal agencies and out-of-state agencies. They told me that they immediately terminated the sharing. When I was talking to the chief of police, this is what he told me.
We found out, holy cow, we shouldn't have been sharing with outside of California or with the federal agencies.
Now, I haven't been able to independently verify that this sharing has been terminated, but this termination has been reviewed by city council members.
So, Ryan, if we could zoom out for a minute, license plate readers are talked about a lot as these crime-fighting tools from police. Why would immigration or potential sharing with federal agencies be part of a debate about privacy?
Well, what Elias just talked about is an issue that CalMatters and other groups have uncovered over the last year. Apparently, Flock Safety, one of these prominent license plate reader companies, had a pilot program that allowed federal authorities to search local license plate data. And as Tracy Rosenberg of Oakland Privacy told me, police departments all across the state learned after the fact, just like Chico did with Elias's records request. And they all, went, pick your 4-letter word. Oh, no, right?
Elias, you also spoke with Nick Hidalgo. He's a senior staff attorney with the ACLU of Northern California. Here's what he had to say.
That law is crystal clear that a law enforcement agency in the state of California is not allowed to share automated license plate reader information with any law enforcement agency outside of the state.
And Flock says on its website that it's stopped those pilot programs. It says it doesn't work with ICE. And as far as the police agencies go, they're very concerned about having these tools disappear. As I noted in my story, in the last year alone, these license plate readers have helped catch suspected murderers. They've caught bank robbers. They've caught hit and run drivers. They've helped locate dozens of stolen cars. And there was a case that just concluded the evidence collected from one of these license plate readers actually helped convict a wildland arsonist. And so you can imagine as the debates about this are happening, police are saying, hey, you guys are going to take a very useful tool away from us, and we'd like to be able to keep it.
Ryan, you're mentioning that this is happening all around California. From Elias's investigation into Chico, is that unique to Chico?
Not at all. Our team looked at some of this stuff last year. We found that California officers have repeatedly violated that law that prohibits sharing of data. And as I was told by privacy advocates, the police agencies were often as surprised as they were to learn that the federal government and other states had been accessing this data.
So if this is something that has been documented and discussed for a long time, Elias, why do you think that this went unnoticed for so long in Chico?
Well, I think that as Ryan touched upon, this concern nationally with these flock ALPRs has grown to prominence a lot in the last year, frankly. In Chico, however, they use a company called Motorola, which wasn't suspected of wrongdoing at a national level up until very recently. I think in 2021, there was a case the ACLU filed in Marin that these Motorola cameras were sharing with federal agencies. In 2023, the AG sued a city in San Bernardino County for similar practices. And so I think that Chico not having flock cameras, but having Motorola kind of skirted the critical eye a little bit. But I also think that these technologies are just so new and so advanced that people who would generally be concerned with the comportment of a police department are just not aware of what the departments are able to do with this data and aren't even aware of the questions that they need to be asking about where is this data going, what type of data is collected, and what is it capable of identifying. So I think that as these technologies just advance and evolve, so does our need to be able to question them and to understand what is being used in our communities.
Ryan, in your reporting, where does transparency come up in all of this within discussions between lawmakers and dynamics between communities and local law enforcement?
Well, since 2019, California Democratic lawmakers have been unsuccessfully trying to restrict how police use this data. They're trying to, again, this year with a bill that would add limits on how long police can retain the data, how they access it, and who they share it with. It also includes some privacy provisions and things like that. Last year, one of these bills, a very similar one that's being debated this year, got all the way to Governor Gavin Newsom's desk, and he vetoed it. He cited the concerns that law enforcement had that if we limit this technology as it was envisioned under that bill and is very similar to this bill this year, it would hinder their ability to work on missing persons cases, cold cases, right? There was also issues with budget. One of the things that the bill last year would require the California Department of Justice to do mandatory random audits of police agencies to make sure they were using the data appropriately. But the budget just didn't have the money to be able to do that. And so Newsom vetoed it, citing that as well. This year's bill has a similar provision on those random audits, but it's contingent on future funding, meaning the legislature at a future date would have to pay for that program.
Elias, when your report came out, what was the public response then to realizing that this had been happening in Chico unnoticed?
In the shadow of my report, there's been a lot of confusion in Chico about the limits of the law. And the police department actually just released their first statement since the publication of my original report on July 25th. And in it, they expressed their own struggle in navigating the intricacies of California and federal law and understanding what is and what isn't legal. Initially, after my report, the police department and city council members told me that they were allowed to share 4 criminal investigations, which allowed them to give information to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Border Patrol, as long as it was under the purview of criminal investigations. And it is seeming now that they are changing their interpretation of that law and starting to understand that potentially no amount of sharing is legal. On the public side, however, there was immediate outcry for the use of these technologies in unknown ways to a group of federal agencies that lack a degree of public trust right now. And so the lack of transparency that the department has comported with has led to anger, has led to fear, and has led to conspiracy about what the department is doing with these technologies. And I think that as the investigation continues into how Chico has inadvertently misused their cameras, I think that more answers will help drive better questions.
And when you say it's led to anger, fear, conspiracy, how is that showing up in the community?
Yeah, I have heard a lot of calls for the chief of police to step down. I've heard for calls for these cameras to be shut off entirely.
And Ryan, this is not a new debate. Lawmakers have been debating license plate readers and the flock systems for years. What feels different now? You just put out a report this week. What feels different now?
Well, I think what's interesting to me is that for years this has been primarily I would say predominantly liberal concern, and Democrats have been leading the charge on this in the California legislature. And you see that in the votes that happened on this bill this year that's pending. By and large, it's Democrats supporting and Republicans opposing. But there's starting to be a sort of cultural shift on this, I think. I'm from Siskiyou County originally, and I follow on social media Siskiyou County's law enforcement. And I just saw that Siskiyou County Sheriff just announced that they are going to revisit their decision to install these flock cameras in response to community feedback. And Siskiyou County, I wouldn't describe it as a bastion of liberalism. It is a very conservative place. And as I've noted in my story, one of the things that made me interested in this story was I was going through social media and I saw that Thomas Massey, a very conservative, I would say probably libertarian conservative from Kentucky, posted a picture of a meme of a Gadsden flag, which is the yellow "Don't Tread on Me" flag, with the snake on it. And it had the snake going around one of those flock cameras. And the caption of it was, "Don't flock me." And the idea was, he said that he was going to introduce legislation in Congress this year that would forbid the federal government from giving money to law enforcement agencies that use these cameras. And so I think there's kind of been a groundswell, I think, from the far left and the far right about just concerns about how these cameras are being used.
And Elias, after spending the time on this investigation in Chico, what would you say your biggest takeaway is?
I think that my biggest takeaway is how little is known about these cameras. I think that as the technology rapidly is advancing and is rapidly deployed in cities and communities across the country, I am really taken back by how little residents of these communities know about the technologies used and how little people know about what is capable of being collected from them and who is capable of receiving that data. But I think that what we're seeing right now is concern about how can we manage these systems responsibly and how can there be transparency and oversight going forward to prevent accidental slip-ups in the future.
That's ChicoSol reporter Elias Myers and CalMatters reporter Ryan Sabalow. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
I'm joined now by Press Democrat reporter Anna Armstrong to talk about why planes suddenly stopped flying over parts of western Sonoma County during Bohemian Grove after residents had spent years being told there was no easy way to change the flight paths. Anna, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So you've been covering the airport noise issue for about 2 years now. Mm-hmm. For listeners who haven't followed all of the twists and turns, give us a quick recap.
So starting in 2024, there was a large increase of airport noise complaints coming from western Sonoma County, an area that wasn't usually hit with these sort of planes over their heads. And it was traced to a flight path change stemming from the airport that came from the FAA. And that flight path directed these planes to the west over western Sonoma County, so Forestville, Occidental, Sebastopol, flying at a lower altitude before they turn to go to their destination. So it was really these departing aircrafts. And so in the last few years, there have been a lot of calls to return to the previous flight path that kind of dispersed planes wider over the county.
So help me understand the scope then of the complaints of how important this has been to residents.
Totally. So the Sonoma County Airport tracks noise complaints and publishes reports. And what we saw in 2023 was a total of 1,135 complaints from airplane noise. In 2025, that number jumped to almost 30,000 complaints. And now in the first 6 months of 2026, so January through June, we are at 41,000 complaints, largely stemming from this Western Sonoma County community.
Wow.
Yeah, definitely a staggering increase.
And so how did you realize that this summer there was a new story to tell in this saga?
So we have been kind of plugged into the grassroots resident movements, and particularly with the Sonoma County Jet Noise Coalition. They're a grassroots group of residents in West County who've kind of been advocating for a return to the old flight path. And so they have been responsible for a lot of the complaints coming out of this region. And all of a sudden, in a lot of their social media channels, they were like, hey, it's sounding quieter over our homes. And then my colleague Phil Barber and I came across a notice to airmen called a NOTAM, and it was labeled Bohemian Grove. And when we read that notice to airmen, it instructed pilots to fly the old route that was much preferable to residents, strictly for the duration of Bohemian Grove, so the 3 weekends of the summer encampment. And we figured there was more to that story and kind of dug in.
Interesting. So what did the Federal Aviation Administration or the FAA say about that?
So their reason was to switch back to the old flight path to kind of deal with the increased traffic from all the private jets that fly in for Bohemian Grove and all of the commercial flights that are flying out of the airport every day. So they chalked it up to an air traffic concern. Residents think it has more to do with noise. And if you look at the current departure path out of the Sonoma County Airport, it sends planes right over Bohemian Grove on that flight path. So to residents, this was more about noise than it was traffic, and the FAA says otherwise.
Did anything change? Were there actually less flights that were flying over Bohemian Grove?
Yes. So from January to July of this year, there was an average of about 15.3 flights a day over Western Sonoma County. And that area includes the Bohemian Grove encampment. And during the duration of the encampment, the 3 weekends in July, that dropped to about 2.8 flights per day. So there was a pretty noticeable decrease in the number of flights over Western Sonoma County.
Wow. And what was the response like from local elected officials?
Yeah, so Supervisor Linda Hopkins was also one of the early people who kind of alerted us to this. Her office has been inundated with a lot of these complaints. Same with Supervisor James Gore, who said his office has spent hundreds of hours on these complaints. And so to Supervisor Hopkins, she said that this sort of felt like this sort of great injustice. Her residents, her constituents have been asking for this for 2 years, a change to the old flight path, and they were told that was not possible. And all of a sudden, in her words, it was for billionaires, right? It was this sort of noise break, but only for the rich and powerful who come to Bohemian Grove. And her direct quote was, "It looks like corruption." So they've been pretty vocal, and that even escalated up to Representative Jared Huffman, who hosted a town hall about the Bohemian Grove traffic and some of the concerns over West County. And so at a federal level, we're starting to see some more advocacy for these residents.
Okay, and hearing from the residents themselves at the local level, after years of this back and forth, how did they react this time?
Yeah, I think the initial reaction was, wow, this is such a reprieve, without realizing that it was only for the duration of Bohemian Grove. And when they found out, they were outraged and hurt and re-energized to sort of ramp up their organizing efforts to get some change passed.
Did you hear from any residents in particular that really stuck with you about what this means?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have spoken to Teresa Martinelli, who kind of came up in our first story on airport noise a couple of years ago, who has spoken about the kind of disruption to the peace and quiet of living in a place like Western Sonoma County, where you hear the birds and you see the wildlife, and the constant sort of disruption of the drone of airplane noise overhead. And so she and many others in her position felt very outraged. And I think it's maybe brought about a new energy into their fight to get that flight path changed.
And one thing that struck me in your reporting is how many different agencies are involved in this conversation. How much control does Sonoma County actually have when it comes to flight paths?
So John Stout, the county airport manager, said this best, and I think this is a good thing to remember. Sonoma County, as a regional airport, controls airplanes only when they are on the ground. The second they're in the sky, that becomes the FAA's jurisdiction, and the FAA being the Federal Aviation Administration.
So you said there was a meeting this week. Since this story came out, does there feel like there's anything different or any momentum for change this time?
It's a little early to say. These processes are very long and bureaucratic, but John Stout did announce that the airport's hired consultant did come up with an alternative flight path. And so that's being proposed to the FAA now for approval. And so it remains to be seen whether or not that will be approved by the Federal Aviation Administration, but that is something that is in the works.
And in your reflections covering this, are there any deeper themes or questions that come up that go beyond just the noisy skies?
Yeah, I think one of the main concerns that I hear from residents is you have a federal agency that's making decisions for people on a regional level. And so one of the FAA offices that makes these decisions based in Seattle, you have the part of the FAA that's in Washington, D.C., who are not really living the impacts of this increased flight traffic in Western Sonoma County. And so there's been a lot of questions that have been raised about who gets control over the airspace and how these decisions are made and who is prioritized, and also just notification. This went without public notification to residents, this flight path change back in 2024. The airport says they were also not informed about this. So who gets to make these decisions, and how is that information disseminated when these decisions are made? What is the sort of public involvement in that process?
That's Anna Armstrong with The Press Democrat. Anna, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for North Bay 101, where each week KRCB and North Bay journalists bring you the stories shaping California's North Bay. Our thanks to today's reporters, Elias Myers with ChicoSol, Ryan Sabalow with CalMatters, and Anna Armstrong with The Press Democrat. For more updates, follow along at krcb.org. New episodes drop every Friday on YouTube, the NorCal Public Media app, all major podcast platforms, and right here on KRCB 104.9, Sonoma County's NPR station. This episode of the North Bay 101 was edited and produced by Max Allen, engineered by Mark Prowl, production support by Greta Mart and Noah Abrams, with digital support by Kelly Olson. KRCB-FM is managed by Catherine Nelson, President and CEO Darren Lachelle. I'm Chandra Back. The nation's founders recognized a free press as an essential protection for the people. Today, KRCB's newsroom carries that responsibility with reporting that's accountable to the community we serve. Support trusted local journalism at krcb.org. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.